Oi. Having problems. Come on. There we go. Good evening. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Monday, Yom Sheni. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house? Yehud in South Carolina, Renee in Indiana, Sharon in New Jersey, Melissa in Great Neck, Lorraine in Texas, Bella in Florida, Shendor in the Bronx, Gail in Kansas City, Paul in the Great Northwest, Bill in Mid-Missouri, Joe in the Inland Empire, and Moishi in Brooklyn, Lester in Florida, Lenit in Silver Spring, Lynn in Canada, Chaim in Florida, Nancy in North Carolina, and Elise in Virginia. Welcome, everybody. Okay. Trying to get the system better, more efficient, more reliable. But every time we make a change, it introduces possibility of errors. But okay, not so bad. So I apologize. I think I was a couple minutes late again because of that. But we're getting there. We're getting there. Doing a double page today. Very useful. This week is going to be normal through Thursday. And then Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. So all 3 days, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday will be off, because Nina and I will be speaking at Yom Limud in Houston. So if you're anywhere near Houston or you have a good friend in Houston, apparently the Yom Limud Learning Conference is a fantastic event. They've been doing it for 30 years. This will be our first time there, but we're going to present together, and it should be a lot of fun. But sadly, we'll be away. So we won't have class Friday, Saturday, Sunday. But I think after this, we're 3 pages ahead, so no problem. We'll be right on schedule when we get back. Then we will fall behind when I go to Israel the following week for the Israeli premiere of Guns N' Moses in Jerusalem at the Menachem Begin Center on February 24th. I'm not going to be able to teach while I'm in Israel. I know I'm just going to be running around, multiple screenings, events, talks, lots going on there, and totally different schedule. So the plan as of now is just to take that week off. But we've been there before, and we'll get back on schedule as efficiently as possible. Okay. Our dafs tonight are 31 and 32. Even with the double daf, it should be a regular length show, possibly even on the short side. We were talking about yesterday Rabbi Shimon Shazuri, and it was Rabbi Hanina, and I think it was actually Rabbi Chinana who said in the name of Ula, who said in the name of Rabbi Hanina, that the law, the halacha, is always in accordance with Rabbi Shimon Shizuri. What introduced this is we've been talking about matters that have to be done just right, all of the sprinklings of inner sin offerings, all of the arms of the menorah, and all of the lines and all of the letters of a mezuzah. And then we got involved in the writing of mezuzahs and the writing of Torah scrolls and what could invalidate them. And then Rabbi Shimon Shizuri gave a halachic ruling that was brought down that when a mistake is made by the scribe and he goes to correct it, Rabbi Shimon Shizuri said he can write the name of God above the line. Like when you make mistakes and you're editing something and you put a little caret, and we wouldn't put the caret, but you put the name, you put a word above the line that it's missing from, since there's no space in that line. So somebody had said you can't, put God's name in that way. If God's name was omitted, you're going to have to just rewrite that whole page. And Rabbi Shimon Shizuri said, no, you can put God's name on that line, on that space above the line, though you cannot put part of God's name in that space above the line. And then there was this comment by another sage, in the name of Rabbi Hanina, that the law is always, it seems to be always in accord. Whenever he's in a dispute with anybody, the law follows Rabbi Shimon Shizuri. And then we started examining other rulings of Rabbi Shimon Shizuri in other areas and asking, is this what they were talking about when the law always accords with him? And, we keep finding that is so, but was that the original quoting of a law in Shimon Shizuri's name, or was it more about that, writing God's name above the line? Okay, we're picking this up on 31a, pretty near the top. The Gemara relates another statement of Rabbi Shimon Shizuri. It is taught in a baraisa that Rabbi Shimon Shizuri said, once, so he's talking about an incident that happened, once my untithed produce became mixed together with a greater quantity of non-sacred tithed produce, right? So he has land, he has produce, and before he had a chance to remove the tithes, which would render that produce permitted for eating and selling, but before he was able to tithe it, it became intermingled with other produce from which tithes had already been removed. So in that situation of intermingling, how do you deal with it? What is the solution for that? So here, Rabbi Shimon Shizuri just didn't just solve his own problem, since especially it was his own problem, and he knows that he's going to be biased. He went and he asked Rabbi Tarfon, right, the great sage Rabbi Tarfon, how should I separate tithes from the untithed produce that was mixed with the tithed produce? And he said to me, go and take from the market doubtfully tithed produce, that would be demai, which is being offered by an Am Haaretz, somebody who is, he's not known to be meticulous in his Torah observance, so it's possible that he didn't tithe it properly. Right, so go and take from the market demai, which requires the removal of tithes by rabbinic law, since there's a possibility that it wasn't tithed properly. The correct thing to do is now by rabbinic law to tithe that demai. It's possible that tithes were already taken out of it, but you're going to tithe it again. And separate tithes from it on behalf of the untithed produce that is mixed with the tithed produce. Now, you might be saying, why not just take out of the mixture? Why are we going to tithe from another pile of produce, which is doubtfully tithed, and remove tithes from that? And right, we're gonna remove tithes from that. So what does that mean? We're gonna have to tithe that. So I guess we're gonna remove additional produce from the demai on behalf of this mixture of tithed and untithed, known to be both tithed and untithed. Right? There's no doubt here. Rabbi Shizuri's produce was not tithed, and it became mixed with produce that was tithed. So there's no doubt there. It's just a problem that it became intermingled. So how are we going to remove tithes on its behalf? We're going to take from other produce What other produce? Demai, right? Doubtfully tithed produce. And what's going on here, let me just read to you this note here from Rabbi Steinsaltz. He would be separating tithes from produce that is exempt by Torah law and requires tithing by rabbinic law on behalf of produce that is exempt by Torah law and requires tithing by rabbinic law. One may not separate tithes from produce that requires tithing by Torah law on behalf of produce that requires tithing only by rabbinic law, or vice versa. Right? So the reason Rabbi Tarfon advised him to do this is because tithing from this mixture is by rabbinic law. Why? Because his untithed produce became intermingled with a larger quantity of tithed produce. And by Torah law, it's nullified in the majority, and you don't have to tithe it. By Torah law. By rabbinic law, which is more stringent to protect us from coming to make mistakes, you do have to tithe it. Likewise, the demai, by Torah law, you don't have to assume that these people didn't tithe it. It's just a possibility they didn't tithe it. By rabbinic law, which is more stringent, we have to tithe demai, even though it might have been tithed already. So the solution creates a situation where you are going to pull tithes from something that is required by rabbinic law on behalf of another pile of produce, which for a different reason is also required to be tithed by rabbinic law. So that's the structure that we're creating here. Now, the Gemara explains that Rabbi Tarfon, and what's operative here is which kind of tithing is required by Torah law and which is required by rabbinic law. So, Rabbi Tarfon holds that by Torah law, the minority of untithed produce is nullified in the majority of tithed produce. That's the accidental intermingling that Rabbi Shazuri experienced. And it would therefore be exempt from tithes. That's by Torah law. By rabbinic law, it is by rabbinic law that it is not nullified, and therefore one is obligated to separate tithes from it. And additionally, Rabbi Tarfon holds that the majority of those who are unreliable with regard to tithes, right, amei haaretz, these people who are not knowledgeable in Torah law or maybe a little bit, quick to make errors in their own favor when it comes to tithing. The majority of those who are unreliable with regard to tithing do separate tithes, right? So even though there's a suspicion about these people, there's a doubt, but the reality is that most of them do tithe. It's just that it's possible that some don't, and the one that we might be buying from might be in that minority. So in that case, since there's a majority in both, a majority of the amei haaretz do tithe, the minority don't, right? So in which case, by Torah law, one is not obligated to separate tithes from produce purchased in the market. But by rabbinic law, you are, unless you know you're getting it from a chaver, right? Somebody who for sure tithed it properly. And therefore, if Rabbi Shimon Shazuri receives produce from an am haaretz means nation of the land, but it refers to people who are ignorant and not well educated, and that's why they're suspected of not tithing properly, not because of their ethics, but just that they don't know better, right? Right. So, and therefore, if Rabbi Shimon Shazuri receives produce from an am haaretz, he is considered by Torah law to be separating tithes from exempt produce on behalf of exempt produce, while all of it is obligated in tithes by rabbinic law. So he's doing it according to rabbinic law, and by Torah law it's exempt on both sides. But by rabbinic law, he's going to be tithing in a way that works. So the Gemara suggests that Rabbi Tarfon could have told him a different solution. But let Rabbi Tarfon say to him, go and take produce from a Gentile. Now, this would be a Gentile who's living in the land of Israel. Now, so this would be the ger toshav, the resident alien. Is he obligated in tithing if he owns land in the Holy Land when the temple is standing and tithing is obligatory for everybody? I don't remember all the nuances of that law, so let's just keep reading here. since it is exempt from tithes by Torah law. I think it says, go and take produce from a Gentile. So the produce of a Gentile is exempt from tithes by Torah law, but requires tithing by rabbinic law. So if he bought produce from a Gentile, he could then separate tithes from this produce on behalf of the untithed produce that is nullified by the tithed produce. And this would be another way to tithe from different produce that is rabbinically, that tithing is required rabbinically, but not by Torah law, on behalf of that same situation for his intermingled produce. Now the Gemara explains, Rabbi Tarfon holds that a Gentile has no acquisition of land in Eretz Yisrael. What? Does that mean a Gentile cannot buy land in Israel? Even at least in ancient Israel? That is not what it's saying. It says like this. Rabbi Tarfon holds that a Gentile has no acquisition of land in the land of Israel for the purpose of abrogating the sanctity of the land, thereby removing it from the obligation to tithe its produce. What they're saying there is, if a Gentile bought land in Israel when the temple was standing, so he, by Torah law, would not have to tithe. Tithing is not incumbent on Gentiles. That's not one of the 7 Noahide commandments. If a Jew then bought that land from the Gentile, right, so it came back into the ownership of Jewish people in ancient Israel, the question they're asking is, since the land was not subject to tithing while it was owned by the Gentile, did that land get removed from the obligation to tithe produce from it in such a way that even when it's sold back to the Jews, the tithing is no longer required? So one view is, no, if it comes back into ownership by the Jews, then it needs to be tithed just as if it had always been owned by Jews. Right? So Rabbi Tarfon holds that a Gentile has no acquisition in the land of Israel for the purpose of abrogating the sanctity of the land and thereby removing it from it the obligation to tithe its produce. And therefore, if Rabbi Shimon Shazuri were to take produce from a Gentile, he would be considered to be separating tithes from produce that is obligated in tithes by Torah law on behalf of exempt produce, and one may not do that. So there are those who say that Rabbi Tarfon said to him, go and take produce from a Gentile and separate tithes from it on behalf of the untithed produce that is intermingled in the majority of the tithed produce. If he had said that, that would indicate that Rabbi Tarfon holds that a Gentile has acquisition of land in Eretz Yisrael to abrogate the sanctity of the land, thereby removing it from the obligation to tithe its produce by Torah law. And therefore, when a Jew buys it back, he is going to have to tithe again, not by Torah law, but by rabbinic law. And therefore, if Rabbi Shimon Shazuri takes produce from a Gentile, he is considered by Torah law to be separating tithes from exempt produce on behalf of exempt produce, while all of it would be obligated in tithes by rabbinic law. Now, the Gemara suggests, but let Rabbi Tarfon say to him, go and take produce from an Amharitz in the market and separate tithes, right? Not going the other way. If that was what Rabbi Tarfon's ruling was, why not try the other structure of buying demai from an Amharitz in the market? Why not say, why didn't Rabbi Tarfon say to him, go and take produce from an Amharitz in the market and separate tithes from it on behalf of this intermingled untithed produce with tithe produce? And the Gemara explains, Rabbi Tarfon holds that the majority of Amei Haaretz do not separate tithes, right? Most Amei Haaretz don't tithe, in which case he is considered to be separating tithes from produce that is obligated in tithes by Torah law on behalf of exempt produce, which would not work. Now, so you see, according to the solution that is offered, we are learning what the assumptions are of the rabbi who is offering. In other words, what does he hold, about demai, or about what happens when a Gentile buys land in ancient Israel? We see that what his assumptions are about those rulings, according to what solution he's offering for this tithing of intermingled produce situation. So Rav Yemar bar Shalamya sent the following question to Rav Papa. That which Rav and Bar Chinana said, that Ula says that Rabbi Hanina says, that the law is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon Shazuri, and moreover, any place where Rabbi Shimon Shazuri taught a law, the halacha is in accordance with his opinion, right? He's always right. Was that said, even with regard to the case of one whose untithed produce became mixed together with non-sacred, i.e. tithed produce? Or was Rabbi Hanina referring only to cases where Rabbi Shimon Shazuri stated his opinion in the Mishna, but not in a baraisa? Now, in this case of Shimon Shazuri and the untithed produce, did he state an opinion? Right? He said, once I had this situation and I went to Rabbi Tarfon, and Rabbi Tarfon said, do the following. What was Rabbi Shimon Shazuri's holding in that? It seems to me we don't know. Rav Papa said to him, but maybe what it means is simply that, okay, but in that situation, we follow Rabbi Tarfon's law, right? Rabbi Tarfon's ruling, right, which is brought down to us by Rabbi Shazuri. So it's Rabbi Shazuri in the name of Rabbi Tarfon. Of course, the problem is it seems like there were two different versions of that exchange and what Rabbi Tarfon ruled. But that's a separate issue. Now, Rav Papa said to him, yes, the law is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon Shazuri, even with regard to untithed produce that was mixed together with tithed produce. And Rav Ashi said, Mar Zutra said to me, Rabbi Hanina of Surah raised a difficulty with this. Isn't it obvious? Isn't what obvious? Does Rabbi Hanina say that wherever Rabbi Shimon Shazuri taught a law in our Mishnah, the law is in accordance with his opinion? Rather, he says that any place where he taught a halacha, the halacha is in accordance with his opinion, and this applies even in baraisas, right? So, okay, we always follow Rabbi Shimon Shazuri. There's a ruling that he rules, right, based on his interpretation of the law, or that he's bringing down in somebody else's name. If Rabbi Shimon Shazuri said it, we can rely on it. Okay, now we're on page 31b and new topics. So, weiter, onward. Rav Zera says that Rav Hananel says that Rav says, if a tear, and now we're going back to writing mezuzahs, right? And what will invalidate a mezuzah scroll and what won't. If a tear in the parchment of a Torah scroll, but again, the work of a scribe, in this case in a Torah scroll. So if a tear in the parchment of a Torah scroll extends into 2 lines, one can sew the parchment to render the scroll fit. But if it extends into 3 lines, then one cannot sew it to render it fit. Okay? That's how big a tear is fixable and how big a tear is going to render that parchment unusable. You'd have to remove that section of the Torah, rewrite, anywhere from 3 to 8 columns of the Torah to replace that parchment and, insert it into that Torah scroll in order to fix it. That's if the tear covers 3 lines. But if it only covers 2 lines, you could just sew the tear. Rabba Zuti said to Rav Ashi, this is what Rabbi Yirmiyah of Difti said in the name of Rava. That which we say, that if the tear extends into 3 lines, one cannot sew it to render it fit. We say only with regard to old sheets of parchment. But in the case of new sheets of parchment, we have no problem with it. You can fix a tear even if it extends over 3 lines. The Gemara adds, and old does not mean literally old, and new does not mean literally new. Rather, those sheets of parchment that are not processed with gall are labeled as old and cannot be sewn, whereas those sheets of parchment that are processed with gall are labeled as new and can be sewn. And this statement that one can sew the parchment and render it fit applies to sewing it with sinew, but if one sews the parchment with thread, it is not rendered fit. So sinew or gid, this is like, you remember like old tennis rackets were made with cat, who remembers this, but tennis rackets are once made with catgut, right? So sinew, that is what's used to sew the parchment together, right? So the parchment is made of the skin of a kosher animal, and the sinew that's used to sew it together is made from the gut of that kosher animal. Some tefillin also have a string made of sinew holding the knot in place on the arm tefillin. And Chabad does not use that sinew to hold that knot there because they loosen the knot and tighten it every time they put tefillin on. Rav Yehuda bar Abba asks, if the tear occurred in the space between one column and another column, but it was of the length that had it occurred inside a column, it would have extended more than 3 lines. And similarly, if the tear occurred between one line and another line horizontally, but not tearing through any letters, then what is the law? It's a big tear, but it doesn't actually, cut any letters. Does that mean it could be a much bigger tear and we could still sew it together or not? That question was left unresolved. Take coup. Okay. Weiter. Rabbi Zeri says that Rav Chananel says that Rav says a mezuzah, that one wrote 2 by 2, i.e. 2 words on each line, is fit. That's not how mezuzahs are written. Mezuzahs actually have a standard format of 22 lines. There's definitely more than 2 words per line, quite a few more. Probably an average of about 7 to 10 words per line. But if it was only 2 words per line, it would be fit. A dilemma was raised before the sages. If one wrote 2 words on one line and 3 words on the following line, and then 1 word on the line after that, what is the law? It's an average of 2 words per line, but on the last line, there's only 1 word. So Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak said, all the more so that it is fit, as he prepared it as one writes a poem in the Torah scroll, like the song at the sea that we had 2 weeks ago. The song sung by the Jewish people at the sea after the Exodus is written in lines whose length is not uniform. And the Gemara raised an objection from a Baraisa. If one wrote it as one writes a poem in the Torah, or if one wrote a poem in the Torah as one writes it, it is unfit. And the Gemara answers, when that Baraisa is taught, it is referring to a Torah scroll, not a mezuzah. There are certain areas in the Torah, right, like the song at the sea, where just visually it looks different. You can see it here. I know it's a little bit blurry, but if you can see that, right down there at the bottom, right, like you see that. I'm sorry, I wish I had better illustrations. But at any rate, it's not just text all the way across, right? Some lines have just a few words on either end. Some lines have a few words in the middle. And that's how poetry, like the song at the sea, is written in the Torah. So that is required for the Torah. But what happens if you write a mezuzah that way? We don't, but if you did, would it be fit? So when that Baraisa is taught, it is referring to a Torah scroll, not a mezuzah. Now, it was stated by Amoraim as well, meaning sages of the Gemara, as opposed to the earlier sages of the Mishnah. Rabbi Bar Chana says that Rabbi Yochanan says, and some say it was Rav Acha Bar Chana who says that Rabbi Yochanan says, with regard to a mezuzah, that one prepared with 2 words on one line and 3 words on the following line and 1 word on the line after that, it is fit, provided that he does not prepare it like the shape of a tent, i.e. progressively widening the lines, starting with a line of 1 word, and then a line of 2 words, and then a line of 3, and provided that it does not prepare it like the shape of a tail, progressively shortening the lines from 3 words to 1. In other words, you could stretch out those words, and you could have few words on a line, but the columns need to be vertical. The margins on each side of the column, right and left, those need to be vertical and not slanted, neither slanting in nor slanting out. Weiter. Rav Chizda says, one writes the last 2 words of a mezuzah. Now, what's in a mezuzah? The first 2 paragraphs of the Shema. Right? So the Shema begins, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Blessed be the name of the Lord forever and ever. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your resources, etc. That's the first paragraph. And then the second paragraph is, and if you'll heed my commandments and love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul, and do all these commandments, then it will go well for you. You'll have the rain at its proper time, etc. But if you don't, if you turn away, God's anger will blaze at you. He will restrain the rain and the soil will not yield its fruit, and you will be forced out of the land. Therefore, I'm very much summarizing. Therefore, keep these words in your heart. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul, and do his commandments, so that you and your children will be preserved on the land, right? You will be able to stay in the land and have your nation in the land of Israel for as long as the days of heaven over earth, right? Heaven over earth. You will stay in the land for as long as the days of heaven over earth if the nation obeys these commandments. We didn't. We lost our sovereignty in the land. We lost living in that. Some Jews always lived there, but the ancient kingdom of Israel ended because the Jews did not follow the commandments. Okay, but the promise that was made in the Torah, and it was kept, right? God said, if you don't follow the commandments, this was going to happen, and that is what happened. But the point is that second paragraph that is what's in a mezuzah scroll. And so since that paragraph ends with, so that you can live in the land for as long as the days of the heaven over the earth, what they want, the way a properly written mezuzah scroll is, and this is the law and the custom, is that it's for the days of heaven over the earth, right? So it says, Kimei hashamayim al haaretz, like on the earth. And so Shemayim should be on the penultimate line, and Al Haaretz, over the earth, is the last line. So that physically, heaven is over the earth, right? Heaven is atop the earth. Since in the world, heaven is atop the earth. That's never changed, so we could have been still living in the land for as long as the days of heaven is over the earth, because that's what we're talking about now. So Rav Chisda says, one writes the last two words of a mezuzah, al haaretz, meaning above the earth, by themselves on the final line of the mezuzah scroll, without the preceding word, which is heaven. And so the sages disagreed as to how this is done. Some say that one writes this phrase at the end of the final line, and some say that one writes it at the beginning of the final line. So the Gemara explains their dispute. The one who says that one writes it at the end of the final line interprets the verse that your days may be multiplied in the days of your children upon the land which the Lord swore unto your fathers to give them as the days of the heaven above the earth. And so you would want it in a similar manner to the verse, for as the heaven is high above the earth in Psalm 103. Consequently, if one writes above the earth at the end of the final line, it will be literally, heaven will be over the earth, right? But if heaven is the end over here of the penultimate line, over the earth will be the beginning of the next line, and it'll be over here. So the question is, are you going to shift over the earth over here, right, and just leave a bunch of blank space and move it over the penultimate words, which is heaven here, or are you going to just do what's natural and then start a new line, which would begin with over the earth or above the earth, right? Either way, heaven is on a line that is above the last line. The question is, are we going to shift above the earth to literally be under heaven, or just leave it where the next line begins? That's what these sages are disagreeing about. Right, so consequently, if one writes above the earth at the end of the final line, it will appropriately be below the term the heaven at the end of the previous line. And the one who says that one writes it at the beginning of the final line explains the phrase as the days of heaven above the earth as meaning, just as the heaven is far from the earth. Consequently, if one writes above the earth at the beginning of the final line, it is far from the term the heaven at the end of the previous line. This is also a bit of a reference to words are close to you, in your mouths, to do them. Not that somebody should say, who will go up to heaven and bring it down for us, and who will cross the sea and bring it back for us, that it's so difficult to fulfill the commandments. Right? Moses was saying, no, it's in your mouth to do it. You watch the way you speak, you watch your actions, all the commandments that God gave us to do. Number one, they're for our good. Number two, they're doable. It's not that hard. Right? It'd be much harder to be a slave in Egypt than to just fulfill the commandments as they've been given to us. So the idea that heaven is far from earth was important in the Torah in the sense that it's very difficult to go to heaven when you're a human living person, but it's much more doable, practically doable, to do the commandments. Rabbi Chalbo said, I saw Rav Huna wrap a written mezuzah from the word echad, right at the end of the first line of the Shema, i.e. rolling it from left to right, as the first verse written in a mezuzah is Shema, listen. As in, listen, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, echad. And so you start rolling at the echad, and then you leave the Shema as the final word, which would be when you unroll it, the Shema is the first thing you would see. And he prepared the two passages of the mezuzah in the closed manner, i.e. starting the second paragraph from Deuteronomy 11:13 on the same line as he had finished writing the first passage from Deuteronomy 6. So the Gemara raises an objection from a Baraisa. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar said, Rabbi Meir would write a mezuzah on doxostos, the inner layer of animal hide, not on parchment, which is from the outer layer, and he would prepare it like a column of a Torah scroll, i.e. long and narrow. And so that's not what the disagreement is about, what the exact material was or what the shape of the column was. Here's the point that they're disagreeing about. Now we're at the top of 32a. And he would make a space above and a space below the text, and he would prepare the passages in the open manner, i.e. he would begin the second passage on the line following the end of the first passage. Right? Meaning, since there's a space between the first paragraph and the second paragraph in the Torah, multiple chapters of other laws that come in between the first paragraph and the second paragraph of the Shema, we say them together when we say the Shema every day in the morning and in the evening. So when those two paragraphs are written into a mezuzah, are we just going to continue from the first paragraph to the second paragraph without a break? Or are we going to, end the first paragraph with a little bit of space at the end of that line, and then begin the new paragraph on the next line, and even indent a little because it's a new paragraph. We don't usually indent, but to start a new paragraph in the Torah, we don't. But in a mezuzah, we do. That was not always the case, but the custom came to do it like Rabbi Meir, and then that custom became so ingrained that it has the force of law. And already that was so, as we'll read in Talmudic times. So the Gemara continues, and Rav Hananel says that Rav says the law is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. That would mean that there is no break. You just continue the first paragraph by immediately starting on the second paragraph with no line break or indent. And what is it not correct that Rav stated this with regard to Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar's opinion, that one prepares the passages in the open manner? Wait, what? Let me start that again. Right. Yes. Okay. Exactly. So it's Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. We are following Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar because he said it in the name of Rabbi Meir. So let me read that again. The Gemara raised an objection from a Baraisa. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar said that Rabbi Meir would write a mezuzah on this kind of parchment, the inner thing, and like a column of a Torah scroll, and he would make a space above and below, and in the open manner, right? He would stop the first paragraph, leave a little space, go to the next line, leave a little space, and then begin the second paragraph. And I said to him, this is Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar saying to Rabbi Meir, I said to him, my teacher, for what reason do you prepare the passages in the open manner, when in a Torah scroll, those same passages are written in the closed manner? And he said to me, since the passages are not adjacent to one another in the Torah, as the first passage is Deuteronomy 6, verses 4 through 9, and the second is Deuteronomy 11, verses 13 through 21, that is why I prepare them as open passages. I leave a space. And the Gemara continues, and Rav Hananel says that Rav says the law is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, right? The open manner that he learned from Rabbi Meir. And what? Is it not correct that Rav stated this with regard to Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar's opinion that one prepares the passages in the open manner? This would present a difficulty to the opinion of Rav Huna, Rav's student, who wrote them in the closed manner. And the Gemara answers, well, not necessarily. No, he meant that the law is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar with regard to those other matters, the space at the top and bottom, or the kind of parchment that it was written on, or the shape of the columns, right? With regard to the space that one must leave above and below the text. And the Gemara asks, and how much space must one leave at the top and bottom of the mezuzah? Rav Menachot bar Yaakov says, and some say it is Rav Shmuel bar Yaakov who says, the space of a full scribe's clip, known as an atba, with which the sheets of parchment are held. Abaye said to Rav Yosef, and you, do you not hold that when Rav said that the law is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, he was referring to the space and not the manner of writing the passages? But Rav is of the opinion that an established custom must be observed. An established custom acquires the force of law. And nowadays, and this is speaking 1,500 years ago, at least, and nowadays, the general custom is to write the passages of the mezuzah in the closed manner, which is not the way we write them now. Back then, it seems there was a custom to do the closed manner, just continue the text with no break. Now, the Gemara provides a source that, according to Rav, one must observe established customs. So where do we get that established customs acquire the force of law? Chalitza, which we talked about in Tractate Yevamos, right? When a man dies and he leaves a widow and a brother and no children, so as we learned many times, there's a yibum obligation that his brother should marry his widow, and their first child is going to be considered the heir of the brother who died without having had the opportunity to have children. They don't have to marry each other, but if they're not going to marry each other, then she is not free to marry anyone else until they perform the chalitza ceremony. And part of the chalitza ceremony is that she removes the footwear of her brother-in-law, and they recite certain lines from the Torah, and it's done in front of a rabbinic court, in front of a beis din. And then once they go through that ceremony, she can go marry whoever she wants. There's no longer any obligation to her former brother-in-law. Okay, why did I say footwear? Because there was a dispute. What exactly is being removed from the foot? Is it a shoe or is it a sandal? I believe that the Torah says sandal, but let's see. I think the Torah says sandal. So the question is, can you do it with a shoe? Let's see. So chalitza is the ritual that frees the widow of a childless man from the obligation to enter into levirate marriage with her late husband's brother. This ceremony involves the widow removing her brother-in-law's sandal from his foot. Rabbah spoke of the importance of observing customs in that context. As Rabbah says that Rav Kahana says that Rav says, if Elijah, right, the prophet Elijah comes, when we say if Elijah comes, that means that we're not sure exactly what the law is, and we won't know until Elijah tells us. But here they're going to say, even when Elijah comes and clarifies for us exactly what the law is, if he contradicts there are certain things that if they contradict Elijah, we're not going to follow Elijah. We're going to follow the other one. Fascinating ruling. So here. If Elijah comes and says that one performs chalitza with a shoe, the sages listen to him. But if he says that one may not perform chalitza with a sandal, they do not listen to him, as the people are already accustomed to performing chalitza with a sandal. And the Gemara presents a different version of Rav's statement, and Rav Yosef says that Rav Kahana says that Rav says, if Elijah comes and says that one may not perform chalitza with a shoe, the sages listen to him. If one says that one may not perform chalitza with a sandal, they do not listen to him, as the people are already accustomed to performing chalitza with a sandal. So Abaye continues, and we say, when discussing these versions of his statement, what is the difference between these two versions of his statement? The difference is whether one may use a shoe ab initio. In any case, according to both statements, Rav maintains that a custom must be observed. The Torah said, sandal, people started using a shoe. We're going to allow them to use a shoe. Is it required to use a shoe? No, you should use a sandal. That's the right way to do it. But if they use a shoe instead of a sandal, we're going to allow it. Right? Rav maintains that a custom must be observed, and the custom in this case is to write the passages in a closed manner. Now, this is back to the way we write a mezuzah. It seems like the custom became to write in a closed manner, even though it should have been in the open manner with the spacing. So rather, must one not conclude from it that when Rav says that the law is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, he was speaking of the space at the top and bottom and not the manner of preparing the passages in terms of line spacing. And the Gemara affirms, conclude from it that this is correct. Because at that time there was a custom to do it in the closed manner. But now, the manner of writing a mezuzah scroll has become sort of regularized. There's just a way to do it. It's 22 lines, and it is the open manner with a space between, or with spacing at the beginning and ending of the line, and clearly separating this first paragraph from the second. Weiter. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak said it is a mitzvah, ab initio, right? Ab initio, or lechatchila in Hebrew, as opposed to b'di'eved, or after the fact, right? So whenever we have that phrase, we use it a lot, but just to remind us, ab initio or lechatchila means this is the right way to do it. But if you did it a different way, it'll be acceptable after the fact. We shouldn't do the b'di'eved or the after the fact way if we have the possibility of doing it the ab initio correct way. So Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak said, it is a mitzvah ab initio to prepare the passages of a mezuzah in the closed manner. But if one prepared them in the open manner, it is permitted to use that mezuzah. And what is Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar saying when he says that Rabbi Meir would prepare the passages in the open manner? He means that one may prepare them even in the open manner, but it would be better to do it closed. The Gemara suggests, let us say that a Baraisa supports his opinion. Similarly, just as one may not convert tefillin of the head into tefillin of the arm, with regard to a Torah scroll that became worn and parchment of tefillin that became worn, one may not fashion them into a mezuzah by cutting out the relevant passages, despite the fact that the Torah passages of a mezuzah appear in them, right? The passages in a mezuzah are directly quoting writing that's in a Torah. So you might think, well, if a Torah scroll became, worn out in other parts of the Torah, so we would have to retire it and bury it, maybe we could cut out the passages that belong in a mezuzah, or that constitute a mezuzah scroll, and then affix that to the doorpost of a house. You might be able to repurpose that from a Torah to a mezuzah. You might think that, but this is telling us no, you don't do that. This is prohibited because one does not reduce the sanctity of an item from a level of greater sanctity. And a Torah scroll or tefillin is considered higher level sanctity than a mezuzah. The Gemara infers from this baraisa, if it were permitted to reduce the sanctity of an item from a level of greater sanctity to a level of lesser sanctity, then one could fashion a mezuzah from those verses in a Torah scroll. So the Gemara explains why it's mentioning this. But why is that the law? When here in a Torah scroll, the passages are prepared in the closed manner, but there in the mezuzah, the passages are prepared in the open manner, according to Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar in the name of Rabbi Meir. So evidently, it is permitted to write a mezuzah with the passages prepared in the closed manner, which had become the custom, and some say the law, and the Gemara refutes this proof. Perhaps one should infer from the baraisa that were it not for the fact that it is prohibited to reduce the sanctity of an item from a level of greater sanctity to a level of lesser sanctity, one would be allowed to complete a line or two of a mezuzah by sewing it to those lines from a Torah scroll or parchment of tefillin that became worn. But one may not fashion the entire mezuzah from a sheet of Torah scroll or parchment of tefillin, as the passages in a Torah scroll and tefillin are prepared in the closed manner. There's too many other factors at work here. We can't, arrive at the conclusion we're looking for. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. So now the Gemara asks another question. The Baraisa indicates that if it were permitted to reduce the sanctity of an item from a level of greater sanctity to a level of lesser sanctity, one could fashion a mezuzah from tefillin. But isn't it taught in a baraisa that it is a law, lemoshe misinai, right, transmitted to Moses at Mount Sinai, that the passages of tefillin are written on parchment, the outer layer of an animal's hide, and the passages of a mezuzah are written on doxostos, which is the inner layer. And when writing on parchment, one writes on the side of the hide that faced the flesh. When writing on doxostos, one writes on the side of the hide on which there was hair. How then can one use the other side of the hide for a mezuzah? And the Gemara answers that the requirement of doxostos for a mezuzah is stated as a mitzvah, but it is not indispensable, right? The fact is you're using animal skin. And I don't know that much about, creating and treating animal skin to make it into parchment or this doxostos for the use of a mezuzah. But as we see, there's two layers, right? The layer that faced the flesh, that seems to be what we write the Torah scroll on. The layer that faced the hair is what we write a mezuzah on. But that doesn't mean that you can't write a mezuzah on the kind of parchment that was used for a Torah scroll. I don't know. I'm just so not an expert in this, but I was under the impression that you do write mezuzahs on the same kind of parchment that you use for a Torah scroll. And maybe that's where the law ended up. So let's keep reading. The Gemara asks, but isn't it taught in a baraisa that if one changed between parchment and doxostos, the item is unfit? And the Gemara responds that this baraisa is referring to tefillin, that one wrote on doxostos in the manner of a mezuzah, not to a mezuzah, which one wrote on parchment. Right? So doxostos is lower in sanctity than parchment. But isn't it taught in a baraisa that if one changed, whether in this manner or in that manner, it is unfit? And the Gemara explains that this baraisa does not mean that one changed either in the case of tefillin or a mezuzah. Rather, both this manner and that manner are referring to tefillin. And this case is where one wrote them on parchment, but on the side of the hide on which there was hair, and not on the side that faced the flesh. And that case is where one wrote on doxostos on the side that faced the flesh. In both of these situations, the tefillin are unfit. But a mezuzah that one wrote on parchment is fit. Now we're on page 32b. And if you wish, say instead that the ruling of the baraisa that if one change, whether in this manner or in that manner, it is unfit, is in fact referring to a mezuzah that one wrote on parchment. And this is the dispute between Tanaim, as it is taught in a baraisa. If the change in this manner or in that manner, if one changed in this manner or in that manner, it is unfit. Rabbi Acha, in the name of Rabbi Achai, the son of Rabbi Hanina, deems it fit. And some say he said this ruling in the name of Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Hanina. And that's where we will stop and take a few comments. My understanding is that these days mezuzahs are written on parchment, but I could be wrong. Okay. Where am I? Okay, Tom, is the problem, now we're going back to tithing, that even Amei Haaretz who tithe don't always tithe? Otherwise, could you not simply always buy from one you know does tithe? Right, so I think what they were saying there is they don't know exactly how many Amei Haaretz there are. Amei is the plural, right? Am Haaretz, Amei Haaretz is the plural. You don't know how many people are Amei Haaretz, and you don't know how often the Amei Haaretz do tithe or don't tithe, and you don't know how many people who are selling in the market, right, where it's not regulated, there was no FDA, there was no markings, right? So when they would buy from a chaver, then they could be sure, but that wasn't always possible, right? Or let's say, put it this way, the chaverim, the people who are meticulous at the highest level of meticulousness about observance, they would only buy from other chaverim. But most people would buy in the market. So that's why if they went to the market, they would have to, exercise caution, and then they have to get a ruling or follow a ruling about, well, what percentage of, produce that's sold in the marketplace are we concerned that it might be demai? Sounds like by Torah law, you don't have to worry about it, because the assumption is most produce in ancient Israel was properly tithed, some wasn't. The problem is you don't know which wasn't. And therefore, by rabbinic law, if you're not buying from a chaver and you are a chaver, you need to tithe as if it had not been tithed. Joe, are the mamzers required to tithe even though they are outside of the tribe for generations? So that's a really interesting question, Joe. My understanding would be a mamzer is not allowed to marry, a Jew who's not a mamzer, but they are Jewish, right? So Jews are obligated in tithing, and so I could be wrong, but it seems to me like a mamzer needed to tithe like everybody else. The fact that he was, kept out for the purposes of marriage. Remember, we also had that ruling that if a mamzer is a Torah scholar, in certain respects, he's going to get preferential treatment even to the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, who's not a Torah scholar. But the law says that a mamzer can't marry another Jew. That's a separate matter than tithing. Right? And for those who don't know what a mamzer is, that would be somebody. This is one of those tragic situations where the person who is a mamzer, they didn't do anything wrong. It was their parents, right? The mamzer is a child born of a prohibited union, either of incest or adultery, something like that. Sharon, if a Gentile buys land in ancient Israel, what happens to that land at the Yovel year? That's the perfect question. And I think that why would it be removed from the law? I mean, this would be a reason why you try not to sell to a non-Jew. But I think that the law is the law, right? So if it's ancient Israel where they're living under Torah law, not some other regime, right? By the Second Temple period, it was either Persia or Greece or Rome. Who had the absolute power. That was a huge problem. So the Jews were living by the Torah as best they could, but ultimately they also had to live according to those laws, risk death. But in First Temple period and pre-First Temple period, it seems to me there were ger toshavs, so there were resident aliens. They had to live somewhere. Now, maybe they lived in cities, which is a different situation. But let's say that they did buy land. I would think that like any purchase of land, what you were buying is crop years until the next Yovel. And I would think, I could be wrong, I would think that even if a Gentile bought that, they were buying until the next Yovel and it would return to the ancestral family holdings. And Sharon also says, why is tefillin of higher sanctity than a mezuzah? They appear in the same paragraph in the Torah in a parallel manner. Yeah, it's a great question. I was not aware of that until I read it here. But it shows that it must be true since the tefillin passages are written with the same requirements as Torah scroll, but mezuzah is not, right? It could be like a slightly lower level of what you're writing on, that doxostos, which is a different, lesser requirement than the parchment. Why? We try to say that we don't know the relative importance of one mitzvah over another. But we do say, right, that there are offerings of greater sanctity and lesser sanctity. So it's not that one mitzvah is more important than another or carries a greater reward than another. We don't know what the rewards are for mitzvahs. But it does involve higher sanctity. And I wonder if that's because, I don't know why. I mean, it might just be that the Torah scroll and the tefillin, more mitzvahs are done with them, right? The mezuzah scroll, protects your house and it fulfills a mitzvah. And it's there all the time. So it's constant mitzvah. Whereas the Torah scroll is studied from, obviously there's innumerable mitzvahs that are associated with that Torah scroll. And the tefillin, I mean, you could say the same thing about the mezuzah. Like when you're wearing tefillin, you're learning, you're davening, but when you're in a house that has a mezuzah on it, you're doing all these other mitzvahs protected by the mezuzah. I don't know. It's a great question. I don't know why it would be. I don't know what the rationale would be, but it just seems that it is so that the scroll inside the tefillin is considered to have a higher sanctity than the mezuzah, and I'm not sure why. That's what I've got for us today, and with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Tuesday. And remember, we'll have class regular times Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and then we'll be off Friday, Saturday, Sunday while Nina and I are going to Houston to teach at Yom Limud. All the best.